like you to give a small hand for Yanky Fachler.
Senator, ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome. Thank you very much. Some people who heard that I was going to be talking about boycotts this evening assumed that I was going to be talking about the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement that Israel's enemies use as a smokescreen for the dismantling of the Zionist enterprise. But I'm not, even though I have a lot to say about it. So this evening my focus is on the man who gave his name to boycotts, Captain Charles Cunningham Boycott, and about 3 20th century Irish boycotts. The word boycott, the voluntary abstaining from using, buying or dealing with a person, organisation or country, entered the English language in 1880. Now in 1873, Captain Boycott became the land agent of the estate in County Mayo of the 3rd Earl of Erne, a wealthy absentee landowner. Boycott's responsibilities included collecting rents from the tenant farmers of the land, and he employed numerous local people, labourers, grooms, coachmen, and house servants. In the Book of Esther, the king asks, what should be done to the man whom the king wishes to honour? Well, on the 19th of September 1880, during a speech in Ennis, County Clare, to a crowd of Land League members, Charles Parnell posed a somewhat similar hypothetical question: what do you do with a tenant who bids for a farm from which his neighbour has been evicted? Very quickly from the crowd came shouts of, "Kill him! Shoot him!" Parnell replied, I wish to point out to you a very much better way, a more Christian and charitable way, which will give the lost man an opportunity of repenting. When a man takes a farm from which another has been evicted, you must shun him on the roadside where you meet him. You must shun him in the streets of the town. You must shun him in the shop. You must shun him on the fair green and in the marketplace and even in the place of worship, by leaving him alone, by putting him in moral coventry, by isolating him from the rest of the country, as if he were a leper of old. You must show him your detestation of the crime he has committed. The very same month that Parnell advocated the weapon of shunning, of social ostracism, Boycott was asked by the Land League to reduce the rents following a bad harvest. He refused. Lord Erne did offer his tenants a 10% reduction in their rents, but they demanded 25%. Lord Erne refused. Boycott issued demands for the outstanding rents, and 3 days after Parnell's speech in Ennis, a process server accompanied by 17 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary tried to serve Boycott's eviction notices against 11 tenants. Within days, Boycott's domestic staff had deserted their posts. Harvesters ceased to work in the fields. Grooms and boys deserted the stables. The blacksmith, the postman, and the laundress were persuaded or volunteered to stop serving Boycott. Shopkeepers stopped serving Boycott, and he had to bring food and other provisions by boat. Unable to hire anyone to harvest the crops in his charge, Lord Erne mobilised a team of about 40 Orangemen from Cavan and Monaghan. The British government provided protection through Her Majesty's Hussars, cavalry and artillery, and a total of 1,000 policemen and soldiers were involved in the very costly eviction process. The huge national publicity forced Boycott to return to England with his family. By November 1880, just a matter of weeks, boycott, the word boycott, was already being used in the Times as a term for organised shunning and isolation. I suppose we should be grateful that Boycott's name wasn't Captain Winterbottom. Otherwise, we'd be talking about winterbottoming people. This evening, we will examine Captain Boycott's legacy via 3 20th century Irish boycotts in Limerick, in Mayo, and in Ferradonsea. Before we examine the 1904 Limerick Boycott, let's take a quick look at Irish attitudes. Thank you, George. Irish attitudes to the Jews in the century prior to 1904. Many of these attitudes are described in Kaleidoscope, which the copies are downstairs, my book on the 100 characters who helped shape the Irish Jewish community. For example, we all know that Joe's father, Robert Briscoe, was the first Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin. But we sometimes forget that 80 years earlier, in 1876, another Jew, Lewis Wormser Harris, was elected Lord Mayor of Dublin. But he died before he could take up the chain of office. So technically, like, he was and he wasn't. But that's in 1878. Another Jew, Sir Otto Jaffe, was twice Lord Mayor of Belfast, 1899 and 1904. The Irish were very involved in the struggle to help the Jews return to their ancient homeland. And this might surprise people that the father of Irish republicanism, Theobald Wolfe Tone, wrote of the proposal to invite the Jews from all quarters of the world to return to their parent country and restore their ancient temple. Last year, in August, Aidan Beattie told us of the strong parallels between Irish nationalism and Zionist nationalism. And in another book of mine called Gentile Heroines and Heroes, I described the 1841 humble memorial of the undersigned inhabitants of Carlow and its vicinity, which urged the British government to take the lead in bringing Jews back to their ancient homeland. This memorial, signed by 320 people from Carlow, followed a public meeting attended by a cross-section of all political parties and religious denominations. Very explicitly stated, both Catholics and Protestants at that meeting. In the same book, I described the writings of the novelist Elizabeth Charlotte Tonner, who spent several years in Ireland and who wrote passionately about the need for the Jews to return home. Back to Limerick. By 1904, the city's Jewish population had grown about 20-fold over the previous century, spurred on by the influx of Jewish refugees fleeing from the pogroms in the Russian Empire, and of course the story of Irish Jewry mirrors the story of Limerick's population. Anti-Semitism, an integral part of Christian European culture for almost 2,000 years, reared its ugly head in Limerick after a large and exuberant Jewish wedding was held in the city in the first couple of days of January 1904. My school friend Avram Sher assures me that this wedding was the wedding of his grandparents. He feels somewhat proprietorial about the boycott. There were discernible anti-Semitic undertones in the Limerick leaders' coverage of the wedding, which compared the finery on display to the poverty of native Limerick people. January the 18th, 1904, Redemptorist priest John Cray, spiritual head of the 6,000-strong Limerick confraternity of the Holy Family, delivered his first venomous sermon. He began with a metaphor. It would be madness for a man to nourish in his own breast a viper that at any moment might slay its benefactor, so it is madness for a people to allow grow in their midst that which will eventually destroy them. Those of you who know your Bible will recognize this metaphor. It is the argument that Pharaoh used in Egypt to enslave the Israelites. Cray continued, "They crucified him, they called down the curse of his precious blood on their heads, and when they were scattered over the surface of the earth, they bore with them the unquenchable hatred of Jesus Christ and his followers. They persecuted the Christians. Ever since, as often as opportunity afforded, they did not hesitate to shed Christian blood, and that in the meanest and cruelest manner, as in the case of the holy martyr St. Simeon, whom they crucified out of hatred and derision of our Lord Jesus Christ." Cray's sermon had all the classic ingredients of paranoid accusations against the Jews. They were usurers, they were taking over the local economy, they were selling shoddy goods at inflated prices. Cray accused the Jews of being willing to kidnap and slay Christian children if they only could. This is reference, of course, to the blood libel. Cray continued, having been expelled from other Christian nations, the Jews were now descending upon Ireland. 20 years ago and less, Jews were known only by name and evil repute in Limerick, sucking the blood of other nations, and now they fastened upon us. And to strengthen his claims, he also accused the Jews of Ireland of conspiring with Jews on the continent to destroy the livelihoods of native shopkeepers. So here we have it, conspiracy, blood libel, deicide, all in one neat sermon. Collooney Street, now Wolfe Tone Street, in Limerick, where most of the Limerick Jews lived, was only a few minutes' walk from the Redemptorist church. The hundreds of Catholics who left the church after the meeting had to pass the top of Collooney Street on their way home. Cray's bile and brimstone sermon had its effect. Hundreds of confraternity members, joined by their wives and children, launched an attack on the Jewish sector of the town, pelting Jews with mud, breaking windows and throwing stones. 11 people were subsequently prosecuted, and it emerged that at least 300 people took part in the melee. Having warmed up his flock in his first sermon, an unrepentant Cray delivered a second sermon a few days later. This time he came up with a concrete suggestion. If the citizens of Limerick want to put an end to Jewish commercial enterprise, he thundered, they should boycott it. The cry was enthusiastically echoed by the Limerick leader. Ireland is at present being drained of its Gaelic population by emigration, warned the editor, and Jewish colonists are trooping in to fill up the places of emigrants and to turn Ireland into a filthy ghetto. That takes some imagination, doesn't it? The Irish Independent supported the boycott. Father Murphy, spiritual director of the Women's Confraternity, supported the boycott. The town's trade unions supported the boycott. The obedient Catholics of Limerick supported the boycott of Jewish businesses. Even Limerick's Protestant community, many of whom were also traders, supported the boycott. Many of Cray's Catholic audience interpreted his words as giving them license to repudiate any outstanding loans to Jews who are now unable to collect without the threat of violence. This, of course, is the old trick throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. Monarchs would borrow money from the Jews and then expel them to avoid having to repay the debts. Rumours were rife about Jewish shopkeepers and peddlers who sold drugged tea to unsuspecting customers in order to force them into debt and eventually acquire their land. Oh, those Jews. Others assailed the immoral nature of peddling. Jewish men knocking on the doors of homes while the man of the house was at work. As the boycott and the non-payment of debts intensified, almost every Jewish trader in Limerick became penniless. Luckily, no one was killed during the unrest, which is why references in the literature to the Limerick Pogrom are not realistic. It was not a pogrom, it was a very nasty and violent boycott. But it was as if the people of Limerick had followed a script prepared for them by the Tsar of Russia. Attack the Jews, attack Jewish property, boycott Jewish businesses. And eventually some 80 of Limerick's 120 Jewish souls fled the city. What was Cray's real motivation in attacking the Jews? Undoubtedly, traditional Catholic Church anti-Semitism played a role. But historians now claim that the source of Cray's anti-Semitic outburst lies in France, of all places. And I'm very indebted to my friend Joe Briscoe for alerting me to the curious connection between Cray and the Dreyfus affair. When Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jewish army officer, was found guilty of spying for Germany in 1894, the struggle in France to prove his innocence pitted the Republican Dreyfusards against the right-wing anti-Dreyfusards, the monarchists, the army, and the Catholic Church. And after Dreyfus was exonerated, anti-clericalism became a major platform of the Radical Socialist Party that formed a government in 1902, very significant date. Because in the months prior to Creag's call for a boycott in Limerick, the French government had closed down the religious schools, dissolved all the religious orders, and booted the Redemptorist order out of France. We don't have to look far for how this affected Creag's views. In his second sermon, he says explicitly, and this is not always quoted when people looked at what Creag was on about. If you want an example, he said, look to France. What is going on at present in that land? The little children are being deprived of their education. No nun, monk, or priest can teach in a school. The little ones are forced to go where God's name is never mentioned, to go to godless schools. The Jews are in league with the Freemasons of France and have succeeded in turning out of that country all nuns and religious orders. And he carries on. The Redemptorist fathers, to the number of 200, have been turned out of France, and that is what the Jews would do in our own country if they were allowed to get into power. An astonishing connection with the Dreyfus affair that would not normally have figured in the story of the Limerick boycott. So, Creag's motivation for the boycott was his fear that the Jews would kick him and the Redemptorists out of Ireland, just as they had done in France. Creag's crippling economic boycott of the Jewish community of Limerick lasted over 2 years. Several Limerick families made their way to Cork, including the family of Gerald Goldberg, who was to become Cork's first Jewish Lord Mayor. Gerald's aunt, Fanny Marcus, describes how her father, Louis, was injured when Limerick townsfolk attacked the Jews. Father was struck on the head and fell to the ground. His shout probably saved David Weinrock a similar blow. He turned quickly and got a lesser blow in the face. A big burly man with a shillelagh?
Well done.
That's it? Have I pronounced it? Oh, thank you, thank you. Was flailing it about and shouting, "I'll kill those bloody Jews." Someone picked up Father from the ground and he asked to be put in a sidecar and taken to Barrington's hospital. This was quite a distance away. His head was bleeding profusely, and I don't know how he could have got to the hospital on his own. I don't know how David Weinrock got home, but he was put to bed, where he remained for some days suffering from shock. He gave Mother and Bubba is the grandma, the news about Father, and they were terror-stricken. Father got home sometime later with stitches in his head and was in bed for a while. The shock upset him very much, and as I say, the family moved to Cork. Creag's accusations that the Jews thirsted for Christian blood prompted Michael Davitt of the Land League to attack Creag's blood libel. Davitt had been a journalist in Kishinev a year earlier to cover the first major pogrom of the 20th century, in which 50 Jews had been murdered. Now, anyone who knows anything about pogroms, and I in no way wish to minimize this, but 50 people killed in a pogrom hardly makes headlines in Jewish history. However, what was special about the Kishinev pogrom is that it was the first pogrom of the 20th century, a century that somehow the world lulled itself into believing was going to be the century of enlightenment, and that even Russia was going to be less Russian than it normally was. And so this was a really serious shock to the system, the pogrom of Kishinev. And Davitt goes out to cover this. Having witnessed where unbridled anti-Semitism could lead, Davitt asserted, there is not an atom of truth in the horrible allegation of ritual murder. And by the way, I'll be talking on the theme of blood libels later on this year. I'll be announcing some of the talks afterwards. Is it not ironic that Michael Davitt, whose Land League helped introduce the word boycott into our lexicon, came out so strongly against the boycott of the Jews of Limerick 24 years later? Creag continued his agitation for several months. The Jews are a curse to Limerick, he said. If I have the means of driving them out, I shall have accomplished one good thing in my life. In case we might think that Cray was acting alone, the confraternity passed a motion that ran, "We tender to Father Cray our very best thanks for his recent lectures on the ways and means of Jewish trading, and that this meeting, representing 6,000 members of the confraternity, express their fullest confidence in his views." Cray's activities were starting to give Limerick a bad name in Britain, and he was eventually moved by his superiors, initially to Belfast and then to an island in the Pacific Ocean. But we can see what the Vatican thought of Cray's brave and principled stand against the Jews, because in 1914 the Pope promoted Cray to be Vicar Apostolic in Kimberley, Western Australia, a position he held until 1922.